Welcome to Tale Grove, where every story grows roots and every lesson touches the heart.
The sun had just begun its lazy climb over the city skyline, painting the streets of Rosewood Avenue in a soft, golden hue. Belinda clutched her worn leather bag tighter as the bus hissed to a stop. She stepped onto the cracked pavement, her heart pounding like a drum. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and exhaust, a strange mix that reminded her of home, but also of how far she had come. Before her stood the mansion, a towering structure of ivory stone and dark mahogany trim, with windows that gleamed like polished eyes. The iron gates were grand and forbidding, flanked by perfectly trimmed hedges. A small fountain gurgled in the front yard, its water catching the morning light like tiny diamonds. Belinda swallowed hard. This was not a place she had ever imagined herself entering, not as a guest, certainly not as a servant. "Good morning," a crisp voice called. Melina, the house manager, appeared from the side entrance, clipboard in hand. Her expression was polite but guarded, her eyes sizing Belinda up. "Yes, good morning," Belinda stammered, adjusting the strap of her bag. Melina nodded, her gaze drifting toward the house's front veranda. "Madame Gina is expecting you. Follow me, and remember, silence and obedience." Belinda's stomach twisted. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would act, but the mansion's sheer opulence swallowed her confidence whole. She followed Melina across the polished stone path, her shoes clicking softly against the marble. The garden smelled of roses and freshly cut grass, but the silence felt heavy, almost watchful. From the balcony above, a tall woman in a sleek black dress appeared. Her gaze swept over Belinda, sharp and unyielding. Madame Gina's presence alone seemed to fill the courtyard, a quiet authority that made Belinda shrink instinctively. "Welcome," Melina murmured, almost under her breath. "But remember your place." Belinda's chest tightened, a mix of fear and anticipation curling inside her. She took a deep breath and stepped closer, unaware that each step would draw her further into a world of secrets she was about to uncover. Belinda followed Melina through the grand double doors, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. The scent of polished wood and faint lavender lingered in the air, a perfume of wealth that felt almost suffocating. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, casting long shadows that danced like silent sentinels across the marble floor. At the far end of the hall, Madame Gina waited. She stood perfectly still, her posture rigid, her black dress flowing like liquid shadow, her eyes, sharp and assessing, fixed on Belinda with a quiet intensity that made her stomach knot. "Come closer," Madame Gina said, her voice smooth but cold, like ice sliding over stone. Belinda hesitated, then stepped forward, clutching her bag so tightly her knuckles whitened. Melina lingered a few steps behind, silent and watchful. "This house has rules," Madame Gina began, pacing slowly. "Rules that are absolute. Silence is expected unless spoken to. Tasks are not suggestions, they are commands. Questions are permitted only when necessary. And above all, respect the hierarchy." She paused, letting the words sink like heavy stones into the quiet hall. "Do you understand?" "Yes, madam," Belinda whispered, barely audible. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, small, unsure. Madame Gina tilted her head slightly, a faint, unreadable smile brushing her lips. "Good. You will find that obedience is easier than rebellion. Those who resist do not last long." A shiver ran down Belinda's spine. The mansion was beautiful, but it felt like a gilded cage. Every portrait on the wall, every crystal chandelier overhead seemed to watch her, reminding her of her place. Melina stepped forward, handing Belinda a neatly folded uniform. "First impressions matter. she said quietly. "Dress properly, move quickly, speak only when necessary." Belinda nodded, her mind racing. The mansion was not merely strict, it was alive with tension, with secrets waiting just beneath the polished surfaces. Fear prickled at the edges of her awareness, but curiosity burned just as fiercely. As she changed into the uniform, Belinda wondered what she had walked into. The rules were clear, but the house, silent, grand, and shadowed, promised challenges she could never have imagined. Belinda closed the door to her small, neatly appointed room, the click of the lock sounding louder than expected in the stillness of the mansion. The room was modest compared to the rest of the house. Pale walls, a single window overlooking the manicured gardens, and a tiny bed tucked into the corner, but it was clean and orderly, a blank canvas for her to claim as her own. She set her bag carefully on the chair, then unfolded her uniform with meticulous precision. Each crease was aligned, each button fastened with care, as if arranging the garments could somehow arrange the chaos she felt inside. The room smelled faintly of dust and polished wood, mingling with the lingering scent of flowers drifting through the open window from the gardens below. Melina appeared briefly at the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Breakfast is at 7. Do not be late. Move quickly but quietly," she instructed, then disappeared as silently as she had arrived. Belinda nodded, her eyes following the retreating figure, noting the soft tap of her shoes on the marble floor. Alone, she began her tasks with quiet determination. She straightened the few books on the shelf, smoothed the edges of her bedspread, and arranged her shoes neatly by the door. Every movement was deliberate, careful, almost meditative. Yet, even in this small routine, her eyes caught details others might miss. A crack in the corner molding, a faint scent of perfume lingering in the hallway, the way sunlight hit the floor differently at certain hours. She paused by the window, glancing down at the garden where a fountain tinkled softly, its waters dancing in the morning light. A sense of calm mingled with alertness. The house was beautiful, almost too perfect, and the quiet seemed to watch her as closely as she observed it. Belinda's heart raced with both fear and curiosity. She would follow the rules, obey silently, but she would notice. Every creak of a floorboard, every whispered instruction, every subtle glance in the hall, she would store it all. Something about this house felt familiar, though she could not yet place it. As she folded the last piece of linen, Belinda whispered to herself, a quiet determination threading her voice. "I will learn this house and its secrets." That night, sleep came slowly to Belinda. The mansion was quiet, but not peaceful. The walls creaked softly as if breathing, and somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked with slow, deliberate authority. When Belinda finally drifted off, her dreams carried her far from the polished floors and into a place that felt older, deeper. She stood at the edge of a river. The water was wide and restless, dark beneath a silver moon. Fireflies hovered above the reeds, blinking like scattered stars. The air smelled of wet earth and night-blooming flowers. Belinda looked down and realized she was barefoot, her toes sinking into cool, damp soil. In her arms was a small woven basket. Inside it, something moved. Her heart pounded. "No," she whispered, though she did not know why the word escaped her lips. From the shadows behind her, unseen hands appeared, gentle, trembling, reluctant. They guided the basket from her grasp toward the river's surface. "Wait!" Belinda cried, her voice breaking. "Please, don't!" The hands hesitated. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the basket was released. It floated, rocking softly as the river carried it away. Belinda ran along the riverbank, her chest burning, her breath tearing from her lungs. "Come back!" she screamed. The river answered only with its endless rush. Suddenly, the moonlight shifted. In the reflection on the water, Belinda saw a woman's face, beautiful, distant, and filled with unbearable regret. The woman reached out, lips trembling as if wanting to speak but unable to form the words. "Mother," Belinda whispered, the word tasting unfamiliar and true all at once. She woke with a sharp gasp, her body drenched in sweat. The small servant's room was dark, the window open to the night breeze carrying the scent of roses and damp stone. Belinda sat up slowly, pressing her hand to her chest as her heart thundered. This dream, it wasn't new. It had followed her since childhood, unchanged, persistent. But here, inside this mansion, it felt louder, closer. As she lay back down, staring at the ceiling, one thought echoed through her mind, heavy and unshakable. The river was calling her back to something she had lost, or something that had lost her, and soon the house itself would begin to answer.
The afternoon air inside the mansion felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of polished wood and freshly brewed tea. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting soft patterns across the sitting room as Belinda moved quietly, arranging porcelain cups on a silver tray. Every step she took was careful, measured, just as she had been taught. A warm, unfamiliar voice broke the silence. "Child, come here a moment." Belinda froze. She turned slowly to see an elderly woman seated near the window. Auntie Chrysable wore a flowing patterned dress, her silver hair wrapped neatly in a scarf. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, rested on Belinda with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Yes, ma'am," Belinda said softly, lowering her gaze. Auntie Chrysable studied her face, leaning closer. "Lift your head," she said gently. Belinda obeyed. For a long moment, the woman said nothing. Her brows knit together, and her fingers tightened around the handle of her teacup. "Mercy," she whispered. "Those eyes." Belinda's heart skipped. "I'm sorry." Auntie Chrysable smiled faintly, though her eyes remained troubled. "You have your mother's eyes," she said, then paused. "Or rather, someone very dear to this house." Before Belinda could respond, Molina cleared her throat sharply from the doorway. "Auntie Chrysable, your tea." Madame Gina entered moments later, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She stopped short when she saw Belinda standing so close. "What is this?" Madame Gina asked coolly. Auntie Chrysable turned to her, studying her face now with equal intensity. "Gina," she said slowly, "do you not see it?" Madame Gina's gaze flicked to Belinda, just for a second, but something unreadable passed through her eyes. "See what?" she replied curtly. "The resemblance," Auntie Chrysable said quietly. "It is unsettling." The room seemed to tighten. Madame Gina's jaw stiffened. "You imagine things," she said, turning away. "Molina, ensure the maid returns to her duties." Belinda lowered her head, her hands trembling as she stepped back. But as she left the room, Auntie Chrysable's voice followed her like a whisper. "Some faces are forgotten," the woman murmured, "but blood remembers." Belinda's pulse raced as she walked down the corridor. She did not know what the woman meant, but she felt it in her bones. She was not just a maid, and the house was beginning to notice.
The cabinet stood at the far end of the west corridor, tall and forgotten, its wooden surface dulled by years of neglect. Dust clung to its edges like a quiet warning. Belinda wiped her hands on her apron and hesitated before opening it, the hallway unusually silent except for the distant hum of the city beyond the gates. "Clean it properly," Molina had said earlier, barely slowing her stride. "No shortcuts." Belinda pulled the cabinet door open. It creaked in protest, releasing the faint scent of old paper and dried lavender. Inside were stacked boxes, yellowed envelopes, and at the very bottom, an old leather-bound album. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. The cover was worn smooth, the initials GG faintly embossed in gold. Belinda swallowed. She told herself it was none of her business. Still, something pulled her forward, heavy and unavoidable. She opened it. The first few pages held formal photographs, grand events, expensive dresses, unfamiliar faces frozen in celebration. Then her breath caught. There it was. A younger Madame Gina stood in the photograph, her face softer, her eyes less guarded. One hand rested gently on her swollen belly. She was smiling, not the controlled smile Belinda knew, but something warm, hopeful. Belinda's vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt as memories flooded her mind, the river, the moonlight, the basket drifting away. Her chest tightened, and she clutched the edge of the cabinet to steady herself. No, she whispered. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Belinda snapped the album shut just as Melina appeared. You're taking too long, Melina said sharply, her eyes flicking to Belinda's pale face. What did you find? Nothing, Belinda replied quickly, lowering her gaze. Just old papers. Melina studied her for a moment, then nodded curtly. Finish and move on. When she was alone again, Belinda slid the album back into its place, her hands shaking. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the house could hear it. The image burned behind her eyes, the woman, the child, the unspoken truth. As Belinda closed the cabinet, she felt it with terrifying clarity. The dream was no longer just a dream. The past was real. And it was waiting for her to ask the question she was no longer sure she could avoid. The rain began just before dusk, tapping softly against the tall windows of the mansion like a warning. Belinda stood in the doorway of Madame Gina's private sitting room, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the distant city traffic beyond the gates. Speak, Madame Gina said without looking up from her desk. You asked for this meeting. Belinda stepped inside, her hands clenched at her sides. The room smelled of old books and expensive perfume. On the wall behind Madame Gina hung a portrait of her in her younger years, elegant, composed, untouchable. I found the album, Belinda said quietly. Madame Gina's pen froze. For a long moment, neither woman moved. The rain intensified, streaking the windows like tears the house had been holding back for decades. You had no right, Madame Gina said, her voice controlled, almost brittle. Belinda swallowed. I know. But I saw the photograph. You were pregnant. And the dreams, the river, the basket, her voice broke. They've followed me my whole life. Madame Gina stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. She turned, and for the first time, the mask slipped. Her eyes were red, her composure cracked. You were not meant to return, she whispered. The words hit Belinda like a blow. Then why do I feel like this house knows me? Belinda asked, tears spilling freely now. Why do strangers see your face in mine? Madame Gina closed her eyes. When she opened them, years of regret poured out. I was young, she said. Afraid. My family demanded perfection. Your father wanted love. I chose survival. Her voice trembled. I left you where I thought you would live, not where I lived. Melina shifted uneasily near the door, her gaze lowered. You abandoned me, Belinda said, the truth finally spoken aloud. Madame Gina nodded, a single tear tracing her cheek. Yes. And I have paid for it every day. The room felt smaller, heavier. Belinda wiped her tears, her voice steady despite the pain. I didn't come for money. I came for answers. Madame Gina looked at her, not as a maid, not as a mistake, but as her daughter. And now, she said softly, you have them. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. But the storm inside both women had only just begun. The house felt different after the truth was spoken. The corridors were still grand, the chandeliers still glowed with soft golden light, yet something invisible had shifted. Belinda stood by the tall window in the sitting room, watching the rain-soaked garden breathe under the fading sky. The fountain murmured gently, as if trying to soothe wounds it could not see. She turned slowly toward Madame Gina. My father, Belinda said. The words felt heavy, unfamiliar. Alfred, where is he? Madame Gina did not answer at once. She crossed the room and rested her hand on the back of a chair, her fingers tightening. Melina stood quietly near the doorway, her usual authority replaced by silence. He died 3 years ago, Madame Gina said at last. The world seemed to still. Belinda blinked, as though she had misheard. Died, she repeated softly. Before I ever knew his face? Madame Gina nodded. He asked about you until the end, she admitted, her voice barely steady. He wanted to find you. I didn't let him. The confession landed harder than the rain against the glass. Belinda's chest tightened, grief flooding a space she hadn't known existed. She imagined a man she had never met, waiting, hoping, loving from a distance. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent but unstoppable. I would have liked to hear his voice, Belinda whispered. Even once. Madame Gina lowered her head. I stole that from you, she said. From both of you. Belinda wiped her tears slowly, breathing through the ache. The pain was sharp, but beneath it, something stronger began to form. Acceptance. Resolve. I can't change what you did, Belinda said quietly. And I can't meet him now. But I won't live as if I don't exist anymore. She stepped back toward the window, the city lights flickering to life beyond the gates. Life was still moving, cars passing, people laughing somewhere far away. I will choose my future, Belinda said, her voice calm, grounded. Even if my past was chosen for me. Madame Gina looked at her then, not with authority, but with respect. The rain eased outside, leaving the world washed clean. And Belinda stood taller, carrying both her grief and her strength forward, ready for whatever came next. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of the study, softening the sharp edges of the room. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, catching the sun like tiny sparks. Belinda stood near the desk, her hands folded, her posture calmer than it had been days before. The storm had passed, not just outside, but within her. Madame Gina placed a thick envelope on the polished table between them. These documents belong to you, she said quietly. Your father's share of the property. And what should have been yours from the beginning. Belinda did not reach for it immediately. She studied the envelope as if it might vanish, or burn. I didn't come here for this, she said. I know, Madame Gina replied. Her voice carried no authority now, only honesty. That is why I am giving it. Melina stood nearby, silent, her usual composure softened by the weight of the moment. Belinda finally stepped forward, lifting the envelope with steady hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, not because of its contents, but because of everything it represented, loss, inheritance, and a future she had never been allowed to imagine. This doesn't erase what happened, Belinda said. It doesn't fix the years I lived without answers. Madame Gina nodded slowly. I am not asking for forgiveness, she said. Only for the chance to stand beside you, if you will allow it. Belinda met her eyes. In them, she saw regret, fear, and something fragile, hope. I will walk forward as your daughter, Belinda said after a pause. But on my own terms. A breath Madame Gina didn't realize she was holding finally escaped her. Outside, the garden shimmered in the sunlight. Birds settled on the fountain's edge, their reflections rippling across the water. Life, persistent and patient, moved on. Belinda turned toward the window, the city unfolding beyond the gates. She felt grounded, not because of wealth, but because she had chosen herself. This was not an ending. It was a beginning shaped by truth, carried by strength, and guided, not by the past, but by the woman she had become. The late afternoon sun dipped low, bathing the mansion's courtyard in amber light. Shadows stretched gently across the stone pathway as a familiar figure stood just beyond the iron gates, clutching a faded shawl in trembling hands. Belinda saw her first. Mama, she whispered. Mama Sarah looked smaller than Belinda remembered, her back slightly bent by time, her hair streaked with gray. But her eyes, those eyes, were the same. Warm. Searching. Full of love that had never asked for anything in return. Belinda ran. The sound of their footsteps echoed once before disappearing into the hush of the moment. Mama Sarah dropped her bag just in time to catch Belinda in her arms. "My child," she cried, holding her tightly. "My daughter." Belinda buried her face into the familiar shoulder, breathing in the scent of soap and sun-dried cloth. Years of confusion, longing, and unanswered questions dissolved into quiet sobs. "I didn't lose you," Mama Sarah whispered. "Not for a single day." Nearby, Madame Gina stood frozen. Melina remained respectfully still, her gaze lowered. The woman who had given birth watched the woman who had given love, and finally, she stepped forward. "Thank you," Madame Gina said softly, her voice breaking. "For raising her when I could not." Mama Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Pain flickered across her face, but it did not stay. "She was never a burden," Mama Sarah replied. "She was a blessing." Silence settled between the three women, not heavy, but healing. Belinda reached out, taking both their hands. One hand held her past. The other, her beginning. Tears slid freely down her cheeks, but this time they carried peace. "I am because of both of you," Belinda said. "And I will honor that." A breeze stirred the trees, carrying the distant sounds of the city, life continuing, as it always does. The fountain murmured softly, its water circling endlessly, just as it always had. The circle had closed. Not with perfection, but with truth. Not with forgetting, but with understanding. And as the sun slipped behind the horizon, Belinda stood rooted between two mothers, whole at last, and ready to step into her future.